So there's a question from Alina in Botswana, who's a professor in Botswana. But the question is saying, does TIPSI start research funding for experiment, or do you source research funding for experiment, and or do they have to source their own funding? Where does the IP for knowledge research reside? So maybe Johan can take that.
Yeah, so the experiments are in a way self-funded. It's not like TIPSI has money to fund the experiment. So for each experiment, we will have to make a settlement about the payment. So as Shana was saying, they had to spend time, and how they funded the time, I'm not completely sure, to be honest. But that's a kind of a need locally to see what time is needed, how it will be funded. Working, for example, with Sweden, we have a separate contract with it, but sometimes it can be weaved into existing activity. So it really depends. Also depends, how long the experiment will take. In Sweden, it was 2 years. So this was like 14 weeks, or was much shorter period. So it really depends. In terms of IP, well, we work on the basis of open science sharing. So we expect that if you do an experiment with TIPSI, you will be prepared to share the knowledge. You will get knowledge in return from the other experiments, the research. So we build a collective resource and platform. So it's a give and take, but we don't have IP, so to say. The IP rests with all the people who produce it. You can say it's a Creative Commons license, and in the case, we don't own it because we want to mobilize as many actors as possible. So the basic idea is sharing. And we also do this with the private actors, by the way. We now start to work with private investors. We also say, you cannot exclusively own the knowledge you produce, because we will publish it, make it visible. So this applies for public actors, but then it's a bit more easy perhaps to accept that than for private actors. When we work with private actors, we also work with open access.
If we follow up with that, colleagues from Botswana, do we have any more questions? Alina, did that answer your question? And the colleagues,
yes,
other colleagues.
It did. Thanks. I hope you.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just saying that. Thank you. It did answer my question. That was the main thing I had. I hope it covers basis for most of my colleagues here. Thank you.
Okay. So if there's more question from Botswana, you can let us know.
Well, I do. I haven't raised my hand. I think I'm looking for my hand.
Please go ahead.
Lesotho from the Ministry of Communications, Knowledge and Technology. Thank you for the presentations. The first one, we are talking about transformative policy, innovation policy. I've been listening to the presentations. They're not talking about policy unless I'm missing something. They're talking about projects. Can you please connect there? Maybe I'm missing something. And very closely related, we are talking to experiments. And I wish we could use a more common term. I think I'm still old school. Experiment, I'm thinking of the lab and all that. Can we use a simpler term? I think maybe there's new terminology which just I get lost a bit. And I would like to hear from Ghana, from I think Ghana and Kenya, although unfortunately the Kenyan presenter said they were not really the right person to present. What really was the problem? What were the highlights? Or what really participating in the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, what problem was solved that could not be solved? You know, sometimes we know the right thing to do, but there's a hindrance somewhere. And I think I'm just looking for those boulders that were a hindrance that you managed to remove. What tools how did you remove that? People know they have to collaborate, but they are not collaborating. What I think it's just that meat. I want to hear it, so that I may also, from my point, say where I'm standing. This problem that I have, I think, getting into this process will help. Thank you.
We have Ghana. I think Gordon has just posted a message to respond to a question. So Gordon, if we can hear from you, and then we can also have Shana can come back again briefly maybe and just rearticulate some of the things that were done that could not have been easily achieved without applying this approach. So Gordon, are you able to speak?
Yes, Chucks, yes, yeah. So in terms of what we did, I would say that Wilhelmina is reminding me to say that she typed the thing on my computer, so she posted, I am speaking now. Yeah, so beyond the tools we use in terms of even doing our situational analysis, if you like, so to speak, prior to then looking at engaging the different stakeholders. And often when you are looking at collecting evidence to inform policy, there are certain key stakeholders, of course, key, yet we ignore or we overlook, usually the marginalized. So this approach allows you to look out for the relevant stakeholders and get especially the opinions and perspectives of the groups that are often not recognized in the policy process to get their views on board. Now, for what we did for the e-waste, as Mina mentioned earlier on, e-waste is managing e-waste is a global challenge, and it's a problem in Ghana. In fact, in the pilot, we presented 3 cases, and eventually we settled on e-waste based on scores in terms of what transformations can we have, what the directionalities that can that case presents. And therefore, we were using the TIPSY tools of mapping out the 6 criteria that we use to map out to see whether we can achieve these the changes or the transformation that we want to achieve if we were successful in having managing the e-waste properly. And so beyond these tools, we were able to bring on board the e-waste collectors. In some sector, we may call them scavengers, where their views on board, those who were actually in the field crashing and smashing the devices to assemble the various fractions that were suitable for reprocessing or for that way, let me use that language again, valuable in the waste stream. All those views were brought on board. And that is where we the ministry, MESTI is one of is the main actor, I should say, here in terms of policy making, and they're in charge of making the e-waste policy. And so that's where we ended. And therefore, continuous involvement would, allow for the policy experimentation stage. We didn't get that far. And so this is where I will end up. And so I will say that even with our piloting case, we've learned a lot, and we see the potential for further application in the STI policymaking process in the future engagements. Sorry, my background is a bit noisy. I'm trying to find a space somewhere in Delft to be able to participate in this meeting.
Thank you. That's most appreciated. So
Yeah, maybe, Sean,
then I was briefly.
thinking particularly about the first part of the question, which was about, this is transformative innovation policy, but we're talking about projects, what's the connection? And I think the living catchment is perhaps a good example of actually what is the connection there and why projects the relevance to policy.
Yeah, I think there are various ways to reflect on that. Why look at policies when trying to understand policy. But my understanding of TIPC, and particularly how TIPC has been situated in South Africa, is that part of what TIPC is calling us to is rethinking the way we structure innovation policy. And part of that is the types of projects and programs we invest in as a result of that policy. So it's calling us to think carefully about how we can design projects and programs that would, for example, hold niches, protect spaces for transitioning something new into society. It's talking about how do we design programs that can upscale clusters of projects and learning over a long time into a new position of power within our society, etc. So, and that takes clusters of strategic projects implemented by partner organizations on the ground to get that right. So the way DSI in South Africa, for example, positioned their partnership was to identify a set of projects it was investing in that had that potential for policy learning, potential for making the national ministry responsible for innovation think differently about the way it was structuring its investment and its own decadal plan. And the Living Catchments project, which is part of a larger DSI partnership plan, which is the National Research Development and Innovation Roadmap, was one of these projects. So it's around the learning that the relationship of learning that exists between funders and policymakers and the projects on the ground. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that our project itself took a critical look at this question of policy, because so often and this is a very common thing in South Africa, and it may have resonance elsewhere in Africa. We're very good at writing impressive policy, but we struggle to connect effectively with the right stakeholders, sometimes in that process of development. And more importantly than that, once we get to implementation, that process of connecting science advice with the needs of role players on the ground and institutions in implementation context in the way we implement policy often falls apart. So in the Living Catchments project itself, we decided rather than focusing on policy, let us focus on the practice of policy advice that feeds into policy development processes, policy implementation processes. And so the focus shifted through experience from practitioners, but also the framing that the TIPC concepts brought us to say, let's not look at biodiversity, water, and SDI policy in this project. Let's look at the people who have the task of providing the support into the system, because they are ultimately the humans who will transition us into the future that we need from a policy perspective. And so out of that, we've developed a series of policy communities of practice in the space we work, but also a guideline to practitioners around that intangible practice of policy advice and how you work. So again, kind of layers of tools that support long-term policy transition, but they've got to be embedded in projects with people who will drive it.
Yeah, so I think the concepts and the ideas can be applied on the level of a project, an entire program, or even an entire policy. So that's part of what you can call the scoping process for an experiment. Why I like the notion of experiment. Of course, we have the kind of traditional notion in the sciences, which is really about a controlled process. That we can find out what is influencing what. We work in the wild, so experiments, operating in society. But what we still try to do is get a sense of how we are learning in the process. And to what extent the interventions, let's say, change the assumptions and perspectives of people. So I call it an organized learning process, which is monitored. So through a scientific method. So in that sense, it's an experiment because we get to know what works and doesn't work. And some of the tensions Shanna was referring to were part of the learning, also for us as academics, how to work in practice. So we have a conscious process, so to say, which we document and develop. Because it's a demonstrator which we then want to be used by others. And it's also, the experiment is a capability building process.
Is that?
We have
That
a,
answers the question.
okay.
Then maybe the other countries.
Yes. Does that answer the question? We can see your hand. Does that answer the question? I think it was from Lesotho, the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I've heard. I will wait for others to ask, then I'll follow up later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions from Botswana or colleagues from Botswana? Otherwise, we can get, we'll take one question here in the room, but we can ask Mauritius, Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and Tanzania to get ready with their questions, please, while we take one question in the room. Over to you quickly, please.
All right, quickly. Yeah, I have a lot of questions. So I'll try to be fast. So I have about 5 questions, but you can be brief. So you can be very brief about them. The first one is, the only project we've heard about is the e-waste project. So could you briefly just take us through some of the projects and experimentations that you've done? The second thing, also briefly, I just want your view on the conversations about just transitions, because I hear about deep transitions. And as a young African, whenever Europeans speak to you about transitions and change, it never usually ends well for African countries. So in light of that, I also want your views and the organization's view on South Africa's energy crisis. Is that something that you guys are talking about in light of, speaking about, obviously we're using transformative innovation to move away from carbon-based economies. And in the context of South Africa as a case study, we're dealing with load shedding, and I'm happy that you got to experience it firsthand. So it's not just an academic exercise. Could you comment on that and how we sort of navigate this tension between justice in the process of these transitions and how African countries actually benefit from these transitions? I hope my questions make sense.
They make sense. We'll let you and Hans answer them. There's a list, all of them. There's a list of the experiments already posted online, is on the chart now. So we have many experiments we've done. We've just used Ghana. The Ghana's case has also been published as an academic journal. Again, Kenya's case is also published. We have experiments from Sweden, from Norway, from other countries, from Colombia as well. So I've answered one question for you, and the rest is on just transitions, SA energy crisis, and the notion of change and transformation as well.
Well, just transition has been understood partly as a compensation mechanism. So the idea that the transformation to a sustainable society, some people will lose jobs, some people will have to bear the benefits, the impacts, the negative impacts, and we need to compensate. Well, I find that it's important, but it's a limiting definition. So I would like to look at just transition in 2 ways. First of all, what we try to do is to say, okay, transitions are not forced by Pixie. We don't. This morning we had about controlling. There's no way we can control, change processes. So what we can do is contribute. The process itself also should be owned by the people who go through the process, not by. So we are enablers, and we should stay humble, in fact, and also in terms of, we are not causing change. The change is happening. We are in a process, I would say, of stretching of trying to look at the issue and the problem through a more transformative lens. But in the end, it's, the process is owned by the people. And that's also our understanding of because a lot of policy making, certainly in, let's say, what I call frame 1 and frame 2, is about, okay, the government funds research, and that will then have impact. Like if the impact comes from, it's a kind of linear. That's not our understanding. The concepts we develop, I also see as open standards in a way, or open concept that can be appropriated and used in very different ways in context. And we also hope that the South African experience will then contribute to the global set of understanding. So it's a process where all the members can contribute in a more equal way to the change process. I do recognize that if you look at if you look at the larger issues of, for example, we have been looking at hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, and of course, if you look at from a political economy point of view and the kind of larger, change process, I can see there will be winners and losers. But in a way, so what we try to do in TIPSI is really be practical and focus on actual change processes. And in these change processes, deal with this issue of just transition as much as possible. What I can also say is that working now with private investors, we ask them to look at the issue of social consequences. They don't do that because they do investments, let's say, in solar in Africa. But in their investment process, they never ask this question. In fact. So the question you ask, we try to bring in the process with the actors and stakeholders, but they need to, it's not for us to answer. It's for them so we try to prompt that process. But our role is not to provide all the answers. So that's but I recognize the challenge because there's and I think the climate change crisis, for example, the big issue, in fact, with that is who will have to bear the consequences. That's one of the biggest issues. And that's also what we try to do. We try to match ecological issues to social issues. That's what I also with this SDG. We don't look at individual SDGs. We try to, fuel poverty, of course, is a very important issue. Energy poverty, sorry. So we try to look at the relationships between issues, ecological and social.
There is a last question which you've addressed partially on the energy crisis here, but you talked about hydrogen as well, so I think that has been answered a little bit. We're running out of time, so I want to go to the countries online. So Rwanda, Nigeria, Mauritius, do we have any questions? And then Zambia and Tanzania. I do not have a question. Okay, that's from Rwanda. Marie Chantal is from Rwanda, the National Council of Science and Technology. So thank you, Marie. Zambia, we have John Chongo. We have also Tanzania, Dr. Ngunia. We have Nigeria, thank God, I think is on the call. I don't see the list anymore very well, but we also have Seychelles. And Mauritius. And then Namibia. Zimbabwe, I've just stepped out, so they were in the room here physically. Okay, there was a question, Yuan, while we wait for them, there was a question, but Rob can also take that so we can spare Yuan a little bit. There was a question on where TIP approach has been applied. I think it was from John Mugabe, has been applied in different countries or different contexts, and what is the outcome? And then I see there's another point as well there, so I can pull out the question just to be specific about it. But it was from John, if I remember well. Does has TIP approach examples of countries where it's being used as a framework post 2011 and in STI policy development, but also the lessons? So maybe the case from Colombia or other places. you want to talk about?
Most important thing is to we can apply our own theory to the work we do. So what we try to do is building a new practice of how to do science, technology, and innovation policy. And there's a whole range of experiments and experiences with this in all the member countries. So I really invite you to look at the resource lab, to look at the website, because there's a longer list of. In South Africa, there was also a series of experiments. The one with the Water Research Commission had a lot of our involvement, but there were others which we were much less involved. And the people themselves in the project tried to develop and use the concepts. So there are various modalities of doing this, but our major aim is to make science, technology, innovation policy more relevant for social and ecological issues, basically, and help to address them. And for this, our approach, we need to build a community of practice, a set of people who have experience with how to do this. And there's no one size for all or one answer. So we want to build a whole set of experiences, contextual and local experiences. And the role of TIPSI is partly providing inputs, but also create connection across and building learning platforms and resources and tools. So it's a collective resource that we try to develop. And in this process, we try to redirect science, technology, innovation policy more towards the third frame, without neglecting the first, because we're not saying that R&D is not important, knowledge production is not important, national system innovation. We say it's not sufficient for enabling transformative change. You need some additional elements that we try to build together with all the people involved.
There are two questions online, one from Botswana, one from Nigeria. So I'll just read them out in case you can't read them from here. The one from Botswana says, any regional consortium as an example, if we can mention any other consortium like TIPSI that we can talk about as an example, or can new members join as a consortium member, and does that affect the fees? So configuration of fee arrangements. So maybe that feels a bit more like for you one. For Nigeria, I think Rob can take that. What do you consider the biggest merit of TIPSI framework? And that's from UK from Nigeria. So, but also Shana can add to that, but Rob can take the second question. So in any order, go for it. So you want any example of it?
Well, there's a Latin American hub.
Yeah.
And Matthias is in the call. I think Matthias Ramirez, he can best talk about the Latin America hub. But yes, so there is there's one other regional, let's say, association operating. In Europe, we're also trying to connect, but that's really at a starting phase, because there we work more with individual countries. And but we did organize a number of activities across a number of European countries. About the membership, yeah, if a lot more countries join, there's more money in the common pot, basically, but there's also more work to do. Because, and this is good. But contact us if you are entertaining to become a member in Africa, contact Charles. And then we can, well, we discuss it.
Thank you. The second question was answered partly by Shana, but we'll go back again a little bit of that. Yeah, what is the biggest important? What do you consider the biggest merit of TIPSI framework? So from Nigeria. So what does TIPSI really offer? So Shana touched on it already, but Rob, you want to start, and then Shana can add to that. And then there is another question from Seychelles. We'll come to that after you.
Yeah, I guess I'll have a go from a personal perspective. For many years, I've been working in different ways around development, especially around energy access in Africa. Having lived and worked in different contexts in Africa, including Botswana, Kenya, and Tanzania, over long periods of time, and as an engineer, as a researcher, as whatever I am now, academic or something. And one of the frustrations is when you're close to the ground, as it were, and you see international initiatives, they never really, there are warm words about, local participation, knowledge, but very little practical engagement with real purpose in that sense. So one of the attractive things for me in this framework, TIP framework, is that as an academic, with all the things I have to do in academia, this is actually an opportunity to engage properly and seriously with the real experiences on the ground in a way that gives me an opportunity to bring my knowledge as a contribution and to work with other people to develop solutions. Solutions, I think, is often too strong a word, but processes of change that are going in the right direction. And the right direction is not my choice, it's a co-created answer, so to speak. So this approach is, I think, one that actually does give us a serious chance of doing that properly. It's not perfect, and it needs a lot of work, and Shana pointed to a good few challenges actually in the approach, and we are reflecting on those ourselves, and we need to continue to work with others in order to strengthen the ways in which we do things. But I think, to me, that's the strength, the main strength. That's the main strength.
I think the thing that's sitting with me is this question of the pressure we're all individually feeling to support change. And everyone sitting in this room and everyone online is working on some of the most pressing disasters, challenges facing our society at the moment. And we're feeling enormous individual and institutional pressure to show that we're able to affect positive change in some way. And that's both about the good of society and the world, but it's also a very real institutional pressure that you feel from day to day in terms of your ability to access resources for your work, your ability to design programs that give you long-term space to grow, all of these kinds of things. And that depends on being able to show your ability to drive change. Now, I found the TIPC concept incredibly useful in setting up a framework for describing change, because very often it's just incredibly difficult to describe change. You know anecdotally that things are changing, but how do you set up a framework that is compelling, that allows you to observe in quite a rational, calm way change that is observing over, in our case, a 4-year project, that's a short timeline. But long enough that it's quite confusing to track these multiple small interactions between literally hundreds of stakeholders that we've worked at, and what is that collective change? Now, the TIPC outcomes give you a tool to figure that out. And what it then does is it allows you to observe more clearly what you're changing. So in the Living Catchments project, for example, we had a small amount of money to build communities of practice and fund facilitators in catchment to connect people doing transformative change work. But without a theory of change and a set of outcomes that are helping us to track that change, it would have seemed like a series of random, unrelated events that we were describing. But that time spent on understanding the things that drive change and the language that TIPC gives you today is very powerful. It's very powerful for motivating with future funding. It's very powerful for showing impacts. And as a result, it's very powerful for designing sustainable programs in the system of innovation in the long run, because there will always be that competition for resources. So various things I could say, but that's the thing jumping to mind first.
Lamina and George, how many thoughts, if they're still online?
Well, Lamina and And Gordon, if you can post some message online, there's a request for you to have, if you have some thoughts. We're running out of time, so please, can you post in the chat? We have 2 questions, and I want to leave ample time for our 2 speakers. Again, we're just going to conclude us at the end. So, Annalyn, thanks a lot for sharing what you're sharing online. Tipsy and SADC has been in collaboration, trying to do some work. Annalyn is posting them online. Colleagues, please download that. But we have 2 more questions, one from Mauritius and the other one from, I think, Seychelles. So let me pull the chat out because they've gone up so I can read them properly. The one from Seychelles, first of all, so how does the TIP approach help to build inclusion and ownership, which remains a challenge from policy? So we're going to take the 2 questions together. And then the second one is from Mauritius, is trying to join. They're considering to join, but the question here is they're having connection problems. So thank you. I know the team from Mauritius. They're asking, how has the TIP approach? So the questions are similar. How has TIPSI approach helped to further impact the question of impact, which has been addressed also by Shana? Impact at national level of countries who have been members. So impact, question on impact, how do we connect TIPSI approach to impact? But also how has it enabled collaborations, collaborative initiatives and investments which may come out of the policy experiment? So those are 2 questions. They're related. They're both questions around impact, but around also ownership and inclusion. So I don't know who's going to take them quickly, and then we can summarize. There's a comment also from Zambia, but I think colleagues can read that one. Comment saying Zambia reviewed the STI policy in 2020. Can the TIPS approach help Zambia develop implementation plan? Again, that just links to what Shana was just saying. How do you go from just programs into implementation and measuring implementation as well? So our formative evaluation approach will be useful there. But it's not just the evaluation, it's also learning in the process. So maybe Yoman as well, you can touch on that in your concluding statement. So if you answer these questions as part of your concluding statements, will that be okay? And then we can bring in our Niraj and Mandri to come and conclude this session for us. Thank you.
So, yes, we can help with implementing a policy because what we will be doing with you is developing a theory of change, a transformative theory of change with your stakeholders and yourself for the policy. So this will be a kind of similar process as we do on a project level. But of course, this is a far more, because you will have a whole range of niches. So it's more complex, basically. But I think I'm confident it can be done. In terms of collaboration, that's partly up to you in a way. What we do, of course, we ask questions about who's involved and not involved. So the question of inclusion is part of the discussion in a way. Of course, you also need a stopping rule sometimes because you cannot include everyone in a process. So, the question about whom to involve and not to involve, yes, is a very important question, but it's a process question. Yeah. There's no golden rule, except that we do think that, for example, citizens or societal groups should be involved. So it should not be, and we look at regime and niche actors, it should not just be the dominant actors, because we want to challenge their assumptions. So you need actors that are willing and able and empowered to challenge the assumptions of the dominant actors.
Thank you. There is a question around collaboration as well, inclusion, but also impact and evaluation. So you can share from your experiences, no problem. And it's also your concluding statement. So go for it, Shana.
Just things to say, right? So, any final thoughts?
Shana, final thoughts, just in general, yeah.
Yeah, I think the collaboration point is absolutely core, and I think it comes back to what I said right at the start about the strength of this consortium, is that it shifts the focus from the outputs of science and innovation to the processes that lead you there. So the transformative outcomes, they focus on things like learning and on building niches and designing how do you upscale work that's been done. So it focuses on process, not per se on outputs, because it's the process that unlocks the change. And process being like inherently a collaborative thing. And this, I think, more and more filters to all parts of how TIPC starts to work. It's collaborative in the way you design your country partnership. The stakeholders that want to come on board. It's collaborative in the way that you design or the experiments that they work with. It's a collaborative process that we really keep developing the theory of change. I mean, I could say some quite critical things now. That comes out of 3 years of deep conversation where we have been learning with each other, right? That is the product of collaboration. And you can add that critical nuanced view that you can articulate to each other and understand that it's because we're all learning and fixing this together. So it's a collaboration. It goes well beyond sort of just the tick box word of collaboration, and it's about relationship capital. And I think it shifts this idea of relationship capital back into the way we implement STI policy, which is something we lose sight of when you have a frame 2 kind of thinking, which is where we invest for the future to change. It's about the transaction that's happening right now and how we build it and how this very thing changes us in a small step in the right direction.
That's Rob, final words? So Rob is fine. Oh, okay. A quick one. Okay.
I think I just want to raise some caution. In the African context, innovation is highly necessity driven. I'm not so sure how, when you look at the developed world, where a lot of innovation is more opportunity motivated, whereas in this part you have necessity motivated innovation, how you incorporate that in some of your thinking and your model.
It's always also a question of necessity. Now, who defines what is necessary? So, because there's no absolute, and then the various type of solutions have a different profile, who will profit and who will benefit. So this is part, of the process to answer the question. I think what we do want to do, we start with urgent problems, and we have the understanding that we need deep change. So in that sense, I guess I'm with you, that there's a real necessity for change. But I would argue even more so in the global north, because there are a strong path dependency, what we call lock-ins in the wrong systems in the global north. And if the global north thinks that many solutions will come from the global north, I think they are wrong.
I think the point that I'm making is that there are already solutions here.
Yeah.
It's just how to integrate them. People want to eat, they need to have a meal now. And that's got to happen now. And it's got to find a way to solve that problem now. It's very different from somebody who's already eaten and is looking at tomorrow's and whatever. And what about now? Just go out on the streets.
Yeah.
We got to solve that problem now. And it's that problem. It's not the one for 3 days. No, now. And I think that's the point that I'm making. That's how the necessity.
Okay. If you get to the now, the danger is that you, what we call system optimization, that you come with solutions that fall short of what you need. So I do think also in the African context, it's important not just to look at the now, but to look at the kind of fundamental shifts you need in the way you provision energy, healthcare. So I think while I agree that there are urgent problems now, and that's for me speaks to the funding structure that often take a lot of time. So there are a lot of barriers for acting now. But I do think that the long term is important to consider. Also, when you work on the now, to forget that is danger.
Thank you, colleagues. Can we give a round of applause?